The dealership had been open for exactly 4 hours when the man in the worn work boots walked through the glass doors. His jeans were dusty, his jacket was old but clean. His hands, the kind of hands that told the whole story of a life, were calloused at the knuckles and cracked at the tips, the way hands get when they've held steering wheels through winters and summers without complaint. He walked slowly, the way men walk when they have nowhere they need to hurry to, and stopped in the middle of the showroom floor, looking at the row of gleaming 18-wheelers lined up under the fluorescent lights, like soldiers waiting for orders. The sales manager, Derek Callahan, was standing near the coffee station with 2 of his younger salesmen when he noticed the man. Derek had worked truck dealerships for 17 years. He had learned, or believed he had learned, to read a customer in under 30 seconds. The boots, the jacket, the careful way the man moved through the space as if he wasn't sure he belonged there. Derek set down his coffee cup and said, quietly enough that only the 2 salesmen could hear, with a grin spreading across his face, "Watch this. Guy like that doesn't buy 1 truck. Guy like that barely looks at the brochure." The 2 salesmen laughed the way young people laugh when someone with authority says something that feels like wisdom. The man in the worn boots didn't notice any of that. He was standing in front of the first truck in the row, a long-haul freight rig with a sleeper cab, looking at it the way a person looks at something they already understand. His name was Earl Briggs. He was 61 years old. He had been driving trucks since he was 22, first for other people, then for himself, then, slowly, quietly, over 4 decades of early mornings and long silences and meals, eaten alone at rest stops, for a fleet that now moved goods across 12 states. He had woken up that Tuesday morning at 4:30, the same time he had woken up every morning for the better part of his adult life, made his coffee in the kitchen of the same modest house he had lived in for 30 years, and driven himself to this dealership in a pickup truck that was 11 years old, because there was nothing wrong with it, and Earl Briggs did not replace things that still worked. He was here because 7 of his trucks needed to be retired at the end of the fiscal quarter, and he had decided to replace them. He had done the math over the weekend, added 4 more to the order while he was at it, and then added another 11 because the route expansion his operations manager had been pushing for finally made sense. He had written the number down on a notepad, 11 trucks. He had folded the notepad and put it in his jacket pocket, and now it was there against his chest, while Derek Callahan walked toward him with the specific smile of a man preparing to manage someone's expectations. Before we go any further, if you've ever been judged before someone knew what you were capable of, leave a comment below. And stay with this story, because what happens next inside this dealership is something the staff there still talks about. Derek introduced himself with a handshake and the kind of practiced warmth that was professional but not genuine. He asked Earl if he was looking for anything in particular, and Earl said yes, he was looking at the full commercial line, the heavy haulers specifically. Derek nodded and gestured toward the nearest truck, a mid-range model, the kind of unit a small independent operator might buy as their first or second rig. Earl looked at it briefly and shook his head and said he wanted to see the top-spec long-haul models. Derek guided him down the row and kept the conversation smooth and pleasant, explaining torque ratings and payload capacities and fuel economy figures with the fluency of someone who had given this presentation hundreds of times. Earl listened without interrupting. He asked 2 questions, both of them precise, the kind of questions that came from someone who had spent time inside the industry rather than outside it. Derek answered them, and something shifted slightly in his expression, but not enough to change his overall read of the situation. When they reached the end of the row, Earl stood still for a moment and looked back down the line of vehicles. Then he said, without any particular drama, that he wanted to see the specs on all 11. Derek blinked. "All 11 on the floor?" "Yes," Earl said. There was a pause. Derek recovered quickly, the way salesmen are trained to recover, and said that was certainly possible, and would Earl like to sit down, and they could go through the full product catalog together. His tone had shifted just slightly, not rude, not dismissive, but carrying the particular patience of someone who assumes they are dealing with a person who likes to look at things they aren't going to buy. It was a tone Earl had encountered before. He recognized it the way you recognize weather, not because you're angry at it, but because you've lived long enough to know what it means. They sat at the desk in Derek's glass-walled office. Derek pulled up the catalogue on his screen and began walking through the specifications. Earl asked about towing configurations on 3 of the models, asked about fleet maintenance packages, asked about delivery lead times and regional service center coverage. His questions were technical and sequential, the questions of someone building a plan rather than entertaining a fantasy. Derek answered each one, and the unease he was trying not to feel kept growing quietly in the back of his mind. It was when Earl leaned forward and asked about the fleet pricing structure, specifically the discount thresholds at volume tiers above 8 units, that Derek finally said, almost involuntarily, "Sir, are you actually planning to purchase multiple units today?" And the way he said it, the slight upward tilt of the voice, made the question into something else. It made it into a test. A gentle one, but a test. Earl looked at him, not with anger, not with the wounded expression of a man who needed to prove something, with something quieter and more permanent than either of those things. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and set the folded notepad on the desk between them. "I want all 11 trucks," he said. Derek laughed. It was a short laugh, the involuntary kind that escapes before a person can stop it. One of the salesmen standing near the door heard it and glanced over. Derek caught himself and leaned forward with his salesman's smile and said that was wonderful, and they would of course need to discuss financing options, and he could get the credit department involved, and they could explore what a monthly payment structure might look like. "I'm not financing," Earl said. Derek stopped. The words sat there on the desk between them, next to the folded notepad, and for a moment the noise of the showroom, the hum of the HVAC, the distant voice from a television screen running a product video, seemed to get louder because everything else had gotten quieter. "You mean," Derek began. "Full purchase," Earl said. "I'll put down a deposit today and wire the balance before end of business Friday. I need delivery scheduled across 3 of my yards, 2 in Tennessee, 1 in Kentucky. I'll have my fleet manager send you the logistics by tomorrow morning." Derek stared at him. He was trying to recalibrate. 17 years of reading customers in 30 seconds, and the man in the worn boots had not moved from the chair, had not raised his voice, had not tried to impress anyone. He had simply said what he came to say in the same flat, unhurried tone he had used to order the coffee he hadn't been offered. Derek pulled up the quote builder, with hands that were moving slightly faster than usual, and began entering the units. The total climbed on the screen. When it finished calculating, 11 trucks, top-spec configurations, extended service packages, delivery. The number was the kind of number that Derek associated with fleet contracts from large regional logistics companies, not with a man in a jacket who had driven himself here in an 11-year-old pickup. He looked at Earl. He was about to say something, he wasn't sure what, something procedural, something about the deposit amount, when Earl reached into his jacket pocket again and set down a business card. Derek picked it up. The company name was printed in plain black letters. Underneath it, in smaller text, 43 years in operation, multi-state freight and logistics. Earl's name was beneath that, and beneath his name was his title, President and Founder. Derek looked at the card for a long time. Then he set it down and cleared his throat and said, in a voice that had lost most of its earlier confidence, that they would absolutely be able to accommodate the order. Earl nodded and said that was good, and asked if they could get the paperwork started. What happened in that office in the next 2 hours became, in the following weeks and months, one of those stories that circulate quietly through an industry. Not because anyone made a scene, not because there was a confrontation, but because the contrast was so complete and so clean. The man that the manager had written off in 30 seconds walked out of that dealership having placed one of the largest single-day orders in the location's history. The deposit check Earl wrote at the desk, calm from memory without checking a balance, was for more money than Derek Callahan had earned in the previous 3 years combined. Nobody shouted, nobody demanded an apology. Earl didn't look for one and wouldn't have wanted it if it had been offered. That was the thing about men who had spent 40 years building something with their hands and their discipline and their willingness to outlast every hard season that came at them. They didn't need the room to know what they were worth. They had always known. If you've made it this far, subscribe and turn on notifications, because every week we bring you stories about the people the world underestimated, and the moments that changed everything. The story of Earl Briggs didn't begin in that showroom. It began in a town in rural West Virginia, the kind of place that shrinks a little every decade as the young people leave for somewhere bigger. Earl was the second of 4 children. His father worked at a coal processing facility, and his mother cleaned houses for families in the next county over. They were not poor in the way that means desperate, but they were poor in the way that means you learn early that nothing comes without work, and that work is not a punishment. It is the structure that holds everything else up. Earl drove his first truck at 19, sitting beside a man named Clifford, who ran a small hauling operation out of a barn and took on work that the bigger companies didn't want. Clifford had one rule: you don't put the truck in motion until every strap and every chain is right. Earl never forgot it. He drove for Clifford for 3 years, then took a job with a regional carrier, then another with a flatbed operation out of Ohio, and in all of those years, he was never late, never lost a load, never filed a claim. He saved money the way his mother had taught him. First you pay what you owe, then you put something away, and what's left is what you live on. At 29, he borrowed enough to buy his first truck, a used Peterbilt with 220,000 miles on it that coughed in cold weather and pulled slightly to the left on grades, but ran and kept running because Earl maintained it the way his father had maintained the family car. Carefully, patiently, before problems became expensive. He drove it himself for 2 years, sleeping in the cab on longer hauls, eating at truck stops and rest areas, calling his mother on Sundays from parking lots in places like Amarillo and Harrisburg and Gary, Indiana. By the time he bought his 3rd truck, he had stopped driving full-time and started managing routes. By the 5th truck, he had 2 full-time drivers on his payroll and a small office in a rented space above a hardware store in his hometown. He kept the office there for 11 years, even after the company had grown past the point where the town could really contain it, because he liked the way the drive to work felt. The same roads he had driven as a teenager, the same gas station where he had bought his first cup of coffee before a shift. He expanded slowly and on purpose. Every acquisition was paid for before he moved to the next one. He turned down investment twice from groups who wanted to accelerate his growth in exchange for a stake in the company, not because he was opposed to partnership, but because the math never felt right. The thing they were offering to give him was something he could build himself if he was patient, and Earl Briggs was patient the way rivers are patient, quietly and completely, and without any particular announcement. By the time he was 50, his fleet had 31 trucks and routes in 8 states. By 55, the fleet was 60 trucks and the routes covered 12 states, and his operations manager, a young woman named Vance who had joined the company straight out of logistics school, had been pushing for a route expansion that would require 11 new trucks. Earl had been thinking about it for 6 months. He thought about decisions the way he thought about roads. He wanted to know where they led before he committed to them. He committed on a Sunday. He wrote the number 11 on the notepad and put it in his jacket and went to bed and slept well, the way a man sleeps when he has made a decision he believes in. The next morning he drove to the dealership. Derek Callahan, to his credit, did something that not everyone in his position would have done. When the paperwork was finished and Earl stood to leave, Derek stood as well and extended his hand and said simply that he was sorry for how he had handled the beginning of their meeting. He didn't explain it or dress it up, he just said it. Earl shook his hand and said he appreciated that. Then he picked up his copy of the paperwork, folded it the same way he folded everything, precisely without fuss, and walked back across the showroom floor and out through the glass doors to where his 11-year-old pickup truck was waiting in the parking lot. He drove home the same way he had driven there. No different speed, no different route. The kind of man Earl Briggs was didn't change based on whether the room had just found out what he was worth. He had always been exactly this person. The room had simply been the last to know. There is something worth sitting with in that. The judgment that cost Derek Callahan nothing that morning, except a moment of embarrassment, could have cost him the order entirely. Could have, if Earl had been a different kind of man, if he had walked out after the laugh, if he had decided the dealership didn't deserve his business. But Earl wasn't there to teach anyone a lesson. He was there to buy 11 trucks. The lesson arrived on its own. the way most real lessons do, not as a punishment but as a consequence of the gap between what someone assumed and what was actually true. What Derek learned that morning, what most of us eventually learn if we're paying attention, is that the measure of a person is not visible in the first 30 seconds. It is not in the jacket or the boots or the truck they drove to get there. It accumulates over years, over decisions made quietly and kept, over the discipline of the early morning and the patience of the long road and the willingness to keep building when no one is watching and no one is applauding and there is nothing dramatic happening at all. Earl Briggs had been building for 40 years. The showroom was just where it finally became visible to one more person. If this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today and come back, Mati, because next time we have another story about someone the world got wrong before it got them right. The 11 trucks were delivered across 3 weeks. 2 went to the yard in Nashville, 4 to the yard outside Memphis, 5 to the facility in Bowling Green. Earl's fleet manager coordinated the transfers the way the company handled everything, efficiently, without drama, the way organizations run by people who learned discipline before they learned ambition tend to operate. When the last unit rolled off the transport trailer at the Bowling Green yard on a cold Thursday afternoon, the yard foreman called Earl to confirm receipt. Earl said good and asked if the paperwork was in order, and when the foreman said yes, Earl said thank you, and hung up and went back to the route mapping spreadsheet he had been working on. His operations manager, Vance, knocked on his office door about an hour later and said she had heard the full order had cleared. She was trying not to grin too widely. She had been waiting 6 months for Earl to say yes to the expansion. Earl looked up from the spreadsheet and said the trucks were in and the routes would go live on the 1st of the month. Vance asked if they should do something to mark the occasion, maybe a team lunch or something. Earl thought about it for a moment. He said they could do a lunch, sure. Then he went back to the spreadsheet. That was Earl Briggs. He had spent 40 years learning that the milestone is not the destination. The destination is whatever comes after the milestone, and there is always something that comes after. The route expansion ran well from the first week. Vance had done her homework. The new contracts they had picked up to justify the expansion turned out to perform slightly above projection in the first quarter, which meant they were ahead of the plan, which meant Earl began thinking about the next phase, the way a man thinks about the next road before he's finished the one he's on. He drove past the dealership once, a few weeks after the purchase, on his way to a meeting across town. He noticed the lineup of trucks in the showroom window as he went by, the same fluorescent lights, the same glass front, and he thought of Derek Callahan and his 30-second read, and the laugh that had escaped before the man could stop it. Not with bitterness. More the way you remember a rainstorm you walked through once. It was real, it happened. And you were wet for a while, and then it stopped and the road dried out and you kept going. There is something in the American tradition of the self-made person, the one who builds from nothing, through the accumulation of small correct decisions over a long time, that tends to be invisible until it becomes undeniable. We are better at recognizing success that arrives loudly than success that arrives the way Earl's did, quietly, over decades, without press releases or turning points that fit neatly into a single story. The real story of Earl Briggs was not the moment in the dealership. The real story was 29-year-old Earl in a used Peterbilt with a cough and a pull to the left, heading out before dawn on a cold morning in West Virginia, carrying a load that needed to be somewhere by noon, going because the load needed to go, and that was the job. And the job was the thing that everything else was built on. The dealership moment was just the surface. It was the place where 40 years of invisible work finally caught the light. If you know someone who has been overlooked for what they have quietly built, share this with them. And if this is you, if you are somewhere in the middle of building something that nobody around you can see yet, keep going. The road is long, and the work is real, and the morning will come when it all becomes visible, whether the room is ready for it or not.